This dark, beautiful landscape holds a chilling secret. 8 perfectly preserved mummies have been discovered in a remote part of Greenland. They are Inuits of the Tula culture dating back 500 years. But why are there only women, a child, and a tiny baby? How did they die? What is the story behind their ritual burial?
These people were really living on the edge of life. And if for some reason hunting failed, that was pretty much it.
Because of the age span from the infant to the old woman, I have a lot of feelings that this is a catastrophe.
Dr. Niels Linderup, a forensic anthropologist from Denmark, is on his way to the southwest coast of Greenland to examine the mummies. He is going to document this extraordinary find and hopes to reveal more about how they died.
I'm hoping, along with the staff at the Greenland National Museum, to learn more about the fate of these people, why they died, and to generate a complete documentation of this extremely important find.
Greenland boasts a wild, breathtaking landscape of dramatic glaciers, hot geysers, and icy fjords. It's a vast land where caribou and reindeer roam the interior. This stark place is surrounded by the world's cleanest waters, rich in fish. The land is scattered with brightly painted wooden houses, nestling beneath sheer rocks, in summertime bathed in the golden midnight sun. Dr. Niels Linderup has traveled to Greenland, to the tiny capital, Nuuk. This region has been inhabited for over 1,000 years, first by Norse settlers from Iceland and later by Inuit settlers from the west. The town still bears the marks of both European whalers and Danish colonizers. But perhaps the country's most spectacular historical legacy is the amazingly preserved Inuit mummies that Niels is here to examine.
The find consists of 8 mummies, of which 2 are infants, the rest are all females, no males. Which leads to some of the theories one might have concerning what happened here, why these people died. Because it is kind of unusual to have this whole cross-section of infant to old age and only females.
These women and children are naturally mummified, desiccated corpses, freeze-dried by the snow, ice, and the freezing air. So well preserved that even the hair, eyelashes, and fingernails are amazingly intact.
The mummies were in a cave which sheltered them from rain and snow, and also because the cave was kind of open so that wind could blow through, and the cold Arctic winds here, which are very dry, helped in drying out the tissue.
The 8 mummies were discovered in 1972 by 2 local Greenlanders while out hunting ptarmigan in the long-abandoned Inuit settlement of Krila-Kitsuk. The bodies had been buried in 2 separate graves, situated in caves in the same steep mountainside. They had been buried one atop another. When the hunters discovered them, they were struck by what looked like a doll on top of one of the piles. Only once they had picked it up and examined it did they realize that it was the perfectly preserved remains of a baby. They replaced it and alerted the National Museum of their discovery. Klaus Andreasen was a member of the team the museum sent to this remote part of the world. A Danish filmmaker usefully documented the excavation as it happened. For Klaus and the team, The removal of the bodies was an emotional experience.
I remember especially when we came to one mummy which looked pregnant. She was lying with the hands on her stomach in the way sort of a pregnant woman would sit. At that time, we looked at each other and said, let's take a break. And we needed a break. We knew we had to do the job, but still, sometimes you had also to get peace with yourself about what you're doing. And for the first time I felt this is not quite right, you are breaking something here. On the other hand, we could not leave it behind because the world is filled with too many grave robbers, and we knew we had to secure this find for the public. So having taken a deep breath, looked around in the wonderful nature, we went back and then we continued.
And so the archaeologists took the mummies on their journey across the ice into the modern world. The mummies are now housed at the Greenland National Museum in Nuuk. On display is a unique collection of artifacts detailing the lifestyle of the Inuit people over the centuries, their clothes, their hunting weapons, their tools. But the museum's main attraction and the object of Neil's investigation are, of course, the ice mummies. Shortly after the dried-out bodies had been taken out of their graves, they were taken to Denmark for years of conservation. In Roskilde, 20 miles from Copenhagen, they underwent irradiation using gamma rays to prevent further deterioration. They are now on permanent display in Nuuk.
Well, for me, this is a very special feeling because this is the first time I'm this close to the mummies, and it really strikes you the extraordinary degree of preservation of not just clothing, but also the tissues. For instance, for the child mummy, it's as if it was looking at you with these wide open eyes.
The small baby is displayed lying next to what is thought to have been its mother.
Everyone has a certain feeling when you see a small child, especially a child so well preserved, with a mother. It always evokes, of course, feelings of maybe this could have been you somewhere, or this could have been your child.
After their initial discovery, the mummies were given a forensic examination. Carbon dating of the animal skins has revealed a likely date for the burial, around 1475. The pronounced wear of the older woman's teeth told of a lifetime preparing animal skins, using her teeth as a tool.
The special thing about mummifying is that not only are we dealing with a human body, which we can analyze medically and biologically, but we also have, for instance, in this case, the clothes, which also tell a lot about the culture and kind of also gives a snapshot of their way of life at that point in time when they died.
But how did they die? Could they have been victims of the harsh Arctic environment? In northern Greenland, when the sun sinks in early winter, it does not rise again for many weeks. This time is dark and bitterly cold. Niels is joined by Klaus, now the curator of the Greenland National Museum, in an examination of the mummies. Will their clothing provide any clues as to the fate of the women and children?
They were hunters, or at least their husbands were hunters, and they were hunting marine mammals. We see the seal skin dominates in the dress here with the anorak, the trousers, and also the boots are all made of seal skin, as well as the piece of skin they're lying on. Then they were also hunting birds. We have parts of a bird jacket, a down jacket, coming out here. It's the inner part. And when they were not at the sea, then they moved inland where they hunted caribou, and we see part of the caribou skin coming out here. So they exploited all the natural resources in their environment.
The fine craftsmanship of their clothing suggests that they were well skilled in coping with the elements. it seems unlikely that they would all have succumbed to the cold. The mummies would have been members of the Tula culture who were skilled at living in extreme polar conditions. Their lifestyle was seasonally nomadic. They would spend the summer months hunting big game on the ice cap. In winter, they would travel to camps such as Krila Kitsuk, where the fishing was plentiful. Harvesting enough food from land and sea was a matter of life and death. The food would be preserved and stored to see them through the harshest winter months. While the men were hunting and fishing, the women would sit inside their huts built of whale bones and animal skins. Gathered around whale blubber lamps, they would sew clothing, prepare animal skins with their teeth, and care for their infants. Were the men away when the tragedy struck? Did the women and children die at the same time?
That's the question everybody puts us. Did they die at the same time or not? I'm not quite sure yet. I have a lot of feelings that this is a catastrophe happening because of the age span from the infant to the old woman. And it's very seldom you get that in graves. I think it's something happened, very dramatic.
What could this accident or catastrophe have been? Niels explores the Greenlandic coastline in an attempt to understand what life might have been like here hundreds of years ago when these women and children lived and died. Perhaps an answer lies in the cold Arctic seas. We know that the Inuit needed to follow migrating animals for food, which meant traveling long distances by boat. The men would travel solo in their small hunting kayaks, whereas the women and children would travel together in larger boats, called umiaks. Could this explain the lack of males in the burial? Were the women and children the victims of a tragic accident at sea? Evidence to support this theory is missing. The clothing contains no signs of any small stones embedded within its folds, or other indications that the bodies have been in the sea. The use of an infrared camera reveals more fascinating details on the mummies that would be barely visible to the naked eye. On the chins and foreheads of all but the youngest woman are clearly defined tattoos.
The tattooings are sewn into the skin. They have used a needle and a thin piece of sinew. The sinew has been filled up with soot from the fireplace, and then they have stuck a hole with the needle, pulled it through and pulled the sinew through and pressed the soot under the skin. We have an account from an English sailor who actually tried this, and he needed 40 stitches on 2 inches. So then he couldn't stand it any longer, and they got it all over their face.
It is thought that these tattoos may have been a form of tribal identification. The fact that all the women's tattoos are similar indicates that they came from the same tribal group, even extended family. This may have been one family's tragedy. The world in which the mummies lived and died had changed very little by the time this film was shot in the 1920s. The Inuit way has gone, but fundamental necessities of life means that some customs remain. Modern-day Greenland is a country which still relies heavily on what it can harvest from the sea. The fishermen selling their catch at the daily fish markets pursue a livelihood that has changed little for many generations.
This is a fish market just around the corner from the museum, and it shows still how heavily dependent the Greenlanders are of what they can catch. Especially, of course, 500 years ago, being able to catch fish, whale, seal, and the game in order to ensure survival in this harsh area.
Whereas today, the children of Greenland play confident of where their next meal is coming from, 500 years ago, the fate of each family was in the balance, and starvation was an ever-present danger.
These people were really living on the edge of life, and they were utilizing to a maximum degree the raw materials at their disposal, primarily seal and birds and so on, game. And if for some reason hunting failed, that was pretty much it. We also know that sometimes they would have to resort to infanticide, that is killing babies. Of course, not because they were callous in any way, but simply as a dire necessity of life.
The practice of setting a baby or child out to freeze to death if there was no one to care for it is well recorded. It was an extreme but necessary measure that would limit the possibility of starvation affecting the whole community. It is even possible that the small baby at Krila Kitsuk may have been placed into the grave alive if his mother had already died. What can a detailed examination of this mummy reveal to us about its fate? Klaus and Niels are taking the baby to the hospital in Nuuk to have it CAT scanned. This is the first time the hospital has given over its modern medical machines to forensic archaeology. Perhaps this state-of-the-art technology can provide a clearer picture of an ancient tragedy, the fate of this tiny infant.
The good thing about CAT scan is that we get images with very high resolution, and we see the internal structures to a very fine degree. For instance, with the baby here, we might be able to see if the baby has also an internal layer of clothing. And we can also see to a much better detail teeth, skeletal structures, and also maybe dried up soft tissue.
This is an exciting moment for the scientists. They are seeing a cross-section of the baby's skeletal structure that has never been seen before. Can the scan give them clues as to how the child died?
I know it's partly turned.
Yeah, but you see, now you're beginning to get the eye socket over
okay.
here. And you're beginning to see soft tissue. Yeah. This is remnants of the eye. We have here, the eyeball here.
Not only does the scan give them a better picture of the condition of the skeleton, but also an idea of the material used to clothe the baby.
So far we've seen that there's one layer of clothing and there's no inner layer of, for instance, bird skins. And they've also seen the trousers, which sealskin.
Yes, sealskin, yes. We see the leg bones here, and around them we have the trousers, which are sealskin trousers where the fur is on the inside, and there may be a possibility that we are talking about the sealskin from an unborn seal, which is very sort of fluffy, and which would be, I think, suitable for a baby like this.
Initial findings from the CAT scan have given Niels a clearer picture of the child, but the cause of death remains a mystery. He'll have to wait for more detailed results. From the freezing wastes of Greenland, Niels returns to his hometown of Copenhagen in Denmark. He works here at the Panum Institute as head of its laboratory of biological anthropology. Will the CAT scan help Niels find a cause of death for the baby and the other mummies? Having processed the CAT scan results, Niels is now able to study a three-dimensional digital image of the mummified baby's body on his computer.
Well, this is the first 3D we've made based on the CAT scan images, which were made in Nuuk in Greenland. And we've concentrated on the skeleton here and also on the teeth. And this is mainly just to get a good overview of the skeleton and also to make a more accurate age assessment based on the dental development. And shows that this child was about 6 months of age when it died.
This state-of-the-art technology gives a clear view of every facet of the skeleton, allowing Niels to assess for disease or trauma on the bones.
None of these analyses will probably show exactly why this small boy died. But this is kind of the first step in any forensic documentation. And CAT scan here is an excellent source of documentation. It's complete documentation of the whole mummy, almost literally millimeter by millimeter.
So Niels has yet to find any conclusive evidence as to the cause of death. The original forensic examinations of the Krila Kitsuk mummies, however, did suggest several possibilities. Niels considers each of these in order to reach his own hypothesis. One suggestion is that the women and children may have starved to death, perhaps while waiting for the menfolk to return from a long hunting trip. But evidence suggests that this was not the fate which befell them.
They did find stomach contents in one of the mummies, and that of course indicates that that person had in fact been eating not too long before dying, which of course would seemingly rule out starvation as a cause of death.
Perhaps instead they were wiped out due to an epidemic or illness. Long-term diseases like smallpox will often leave marks on a body.
We didn't find any traces of violent diseases, but on the other hand, we do know that disease such like a violent bout of pneumonia could easily kill people. But the thing is that being so violent or so rapid, it doesn't really leave any changes in the tissues we can examine.
An illness of this kind is still a possibility. Though Niels has yet to find definitive evidence of the cause of death, he needs to consider factors other than forensic evidence in order to unearth the secret of the Greenland mummies.
In putting up certain possibilities or trying to put forward certain theories about why they died, we also need not just to examine closely the mummies as single individuals. We also need to take into account the whole way of life, to put up certain scenarios where we could see or envision something happening.
There is, however, in the bodies evidence which hints at another cultural practice that women in particular were involved in, a practice which may have been responsible for their deaths. Scientists found in some of the women's lung tissue large amounts of black soot.
And that may come as a bit of a surprise, because one thinks of Greenland as this very clean, pristine environment. So why would their lungs be even blacker in a sense than modern city dwellers?
This pollution of the lungs was caused by the whale blubber lamps used in the summer huts and winter igloos. They were essential for survival, providing both heat and light through the dark, cold evenings. These lamps were the women's responsibility. They would have been constantly breathing in the thick black smoke. This in itself would not have been fatal, but Niels is considering a potential scenario which would have been.
If their small hut, where they were sitting huddled together along the blubber lamps, was suddenly sealed off by masses of snow, well, that maybe could account for suddenly high levels of carbon monoxide, which then again caused them to die. But on the other hand, the soot which was found in the lung tissue was quite clearly due to a chronic, long-term exposure.
So the soot does not in itself indicate carbon monoxide poisoning. Of all these potential causes of death, which does Niels consider most likely?
In my opinion, it's probably more likely that it was either a virulent infectious disease or maybe perhaps food poisoning. And the reason they didn't find any males in their graves could be because the males simply were away hunting.
We may never know the exact circumstance of the death of these people, buried with all due care and whose bodies were left undisturbed for over 500 years. This tiny baby, its mother and their companions, have been brought out of the cold and preserved with all respect. Now the most highly prized exhibits in the Greenland National Museum in Nuuk. They have become a precious legacy to the Greenlanders, giving them, and us, a valuable glimpse into the past.
One thing we do know about these mummies is that a lot of care was put into their burial. And I think this reflects some of the common themes of all humankind: love, respect, tenderness, the care for one another. And it's quite clear that these 6 women and 2 small children had been lovingly prepared for the afterlife.